Welcome to this Abolition Acre walking tour today. It's Sunday, August 13th, and any understanding of Boston abolitionism and the hidden history of Boston abolitionism could start right here. This is the corner of Kilby and King Street in colonial times. Now it's State Street. And behind me, on this corner where it says Au Bon Pain, was the mansion of John and Susanna Wheatley. And Susanna Wheatley in 1761 went down to the wharf, Griffin's Wharf, which is now in Chinatown, and bought a 7-year-old girl off a ship named the Phyllis. We now know her as Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley and the Phyllis Wheatley Mansion used to stand on this corner. Right up the street behind us is where the Boston Massacre took place. So this is a very central spot in Boston. Straight ahead of me is what was known as Long Wharf, which was the main thoroughfare when you got off ships coming into Boston. There are all wharfs all along here. This was the Seaport District. And Phyllis Wheatley is our first African-American poet. Hauled into court because people couldn't believe that she could write poetry by the time she was 13. She also published when she was 17, and in October of 1772, she was hauled into court in the building behind us, the old State House, because people figured that she was a fake. Put her on trial, and she was acquitted. Later on, went to England, published her poetry, had 3 children, all of whom died, and tragically died in poverty at the tender age of 31. A tragic story, but she has left us a whole body of very, very provocative poems about being enslaved in the colonial capital of Boston, Massachusetts.
We're behind the meeting house. This is the alley where fugitive slaves would escape. It's called Holmes Alley.
Louis Hayden is one of our iconic figures that we feature here on the Black Heritage Trail and meeting in these buildings. He was actually born in Kentucky in 1811 and was enslaved there. He escapes with his second wife, Harriet Hayden, and comes to Detroit, begins to operate as a fundraiser, and then because Detroit is such a hotbed, the Underground Railroad that operates out of Ohio has furnished their escape, but not their safety. And so they move on to Canada and attend the Colored People's College to become lettered. And as Hayden is very restless in a space that is only farmland and not really busy as an urban area, he desires to go back to Detroit, and so he and his wife locate again to Detroit, and they help a Methodist minister start a church and are seeking building funds, which brings him to Boston. And as they are here, the abolitionists here, including the black and white abolitionists who meet in the African Meeting House, ask him to come back to live here in Boston. And so he and his wife relocate again, and they come to Boston, where he is recognized for his efforts, his courage, and his understanding of slavery, and is asked to join the Vigilance Committee. As a member of the Vigilance Committee, Louis Hayden is amassing funds for all different kind of causes that come under the safety and protection of those who are escaping along the Underground Railroads, who are coming to Boston as a destination to rebuild their lives, who need to be housed, who need employment, who need a place to be educated. So he is very fervent in his desire to assist in that effort and becomes one of the leading fundraisers. He actually even furnishes $500 for the raid on Harper's Ferry that is done by John Brown. And so in this man, we see a man who is not only looking for his own sustenance and the sustenance of his family, but looking out for those who will need some assistance. He then is very instrumental in the rescue of Shadrach Mickens that is due to a 1850 Fugitive Slave Act that can re-enslave people even though they've come to free territory, to be taken back to their former enslavers. And so with Shadrach Mickens, who is working in Boston as a waiter, he is arrested by the marshals and is in court being returned to the place where he was enslaved, when it is Lewis Hayden and a host of other men who rescue him out of the court, put him in a carriage, and then send him on to Cambridge and into Canada for his safety. So when in Lewis Hayden, one of our understandings about the men in this era is that some of them were so fearless in their efforts to undermine what slavery was doing in this country. So we look to him as a great organizer, a great fundraiser, and he even participated in the organizations of the Prince Hall Masonry, started his own the Knights organization that he started, and was spreading Masonry throughout the South. So he's an extraordinary human being, very courageous, and in his efforts to protect his own home when slave catchers were about, he had dynamite at either side of the porch of his home and said with a flare in his hand, "We will either go in peace or in pieces." And so that kind of sums up some of what his work was. And I actually haven't touched on a lot of it, but we have in that man an example of one who was willing to give his all for the end of slavery.
So once again, now this site is the oldest African American church in America, constructed by African American bricklayers and carpenters in 1806, and a whole bunch of very famous people have come and spoken here since its founding. We're talking about William Lloyd Garrison and William Cooper Nell and Frederick Douglass, among many others. We're just opposite the State House here on Beacon Hill in Boston, Massachusetts. And one of the biggest controversies before the Civil War was about arming African Americans to join the Union Army. So on May 28th of 1863, that regiment marched right through here, down to State Street, and onto ships, and went off to fight the Civil War.
Hi, my name is Nadambi Bazemore, and I want to know what happened to the 54th Regiment.
So as fate would have it, the 54th Regiment was marched off in May, and on July 18th they were involved in a major battle at Fort Wagner, South Carolina. They were repulsed with heavy losses. Their white commander, who's depicted here, Robert Gould Shaw, was killed. And it's all been the subject of the movie you may know with Matthew Broderick, I believe, the movie Glory. But this monument was put there in 1897 to commemorate the heroism of this unit, which won all kinds of awards for their bravery and their valor in the Civil War. This monument has been a sculpture by a fellow named Augustus St. Gaudens. Like I said, this was dedicated in 1897. So here we are. This is Boston City Hall. At one time, back in colonial times, this was known as Dock Square. This was all a harbor wharf area where ships would come in, and the first slaves came to Boston in 1638 at this spot right here on a ship called the Desire. So we're here on Tremont Street at the site of the Tremont Temple Baptist Church on a Sunday morning. This was the first integrated church in the United States, 1836. Formerly, this site was the location, the locale for the Tremont Theater, which opened in 1827. And this, of course, becomes the site of a whole bunch of especially important meetings. The plan to rescue Anthony Burns, we just spoke about, was hatched in the basement of the Tremont Temple Baptist Church. Also, this was the site of the celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation in Boston, when Frederick Douglass and a fellow named William Cooper Nell celebrated the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. And also, this was a site of lectures by such famous personalities as Abe Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Charles Dickens, Jenny Lind, and others. So this is a very, very historic site in downtown Boston. We're here in Smith Court off of Joy Street, Beacon Hill. And behind me is a boarding house where one of the more famous figures from African-American Bostonian history, William Cooper Nell, was born in 1817. On January 6, 1832, a snowy night here on Beacon Hill, there was a meeting going on which established the American Anti-Slavery Society, led by William Lloyd Garrison. But also, curiously enough, William Cooper Nell becomes a really famous historian, a playwright, as well as a staunch advocate of integrated education, and was one of the primary responsible people to help integrate for the first time the public school system here in Boston in 1855. But I want to take a moment and tell you about 1847, right here on this street. This boarding house was inhabited by a woman named Nancy Prince. And the problem in 1847 were these slave catchers who were inundating this neighborhood looking for supposedly fugitive slaves, runaway slaves. One slave catcher goes into one of these houses without even knocking, starts looking around to see if there are any slaves available. Nancy Prince happens upon this character, shouts, gets all the women and the children in this area to run out and run the slave catcher off the property with sticks, stones, and curses. A true story, right here on Smith Court. Most visitors to this site know this as Government Center with City Hall behind me. This is also the site of the Sears Crescent building, and this is the heart of Abolition Acre, an area full of African-American merchants back in the pre-Civil War era, including David Walker's clothing store, which is over here to our left. So, as this is an educational endeavor, I'd like to talk with Lamerci a little bit about the Abiel Smith School, where we're right next to it here, between the Meeting House and the Abiel Smith School. And how is the Abiel Smith School really important in terms of education for people, especially African American children? And how is it related to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, and later with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 about access to education? You want to tell us about that?
Well, I can say that the Abiel Smith School, the building built in 1835, is vital to the discussion of education for those who did not have access to that in the public schools, because the Abiel Smith School is built as one of the first buildings in America to house black public education. This community was extremely invested in the education of their children and their community, and not only did this school house the education of the children of the community, but also on Tuesday nights had special sessions for education of community members. And so, as a epicenter of education, it is housing a school that was actually started in 1798 in the home of Primus Hall, Prince Hall's son, in his living room in a home in Beacon Hill. And so that living room operates as this center for education for the children of the community after petitions have been levied to those in charge of public money for schooling without the contributions being made for black children to be educated. The focus became, how are we going to do this? And so they operate that school out of his living room, which is limited space. And after that, there are several iterations of the school, including a carpentry shop, until it is housed here in the basement of the African Meeting House in 1808. The school operates as a one-room school with the pedagogy of the 19th century. It is a wonderful edifice that attests to how children were able to learn reading and writing and other subjects, including ornithology, but were by the school committee not authorized to study English grammar. This community decided that they would study English grammar, and so when 1815 arrives, Prince Saunders, who is the headmaster of the school, has asked A.B.L. Smith if he will contribute money for a building. And he does. He leaves in his will about $5,000 for that to happen. The school committee holds that money based on the disagreement between teaching grammar here as a subject. The parents still, they insist and persist in this education for their children, as they understand reading and writing are tools of freedom. And so by 1834, the money is released and the A.B.L. Smith School is built. It is called the Smith School before it leaves this building because he has been a heavy contributor. This school also, by 1849, is picketed by the parents of the school because there are deplorable conditions happening, because there is not public money being assessed for the upkeep and maintenance of the school. There is also a campaign in 1849 for the integration of schools. A printer, Benjamin Roberts, has a daughter whose name is Sarah, who is about 6 years old, who has to pass 5 white schools before getting to the African school here at the A.B.L. Smith School. He is not very pleased about that, and so he sues the city of Boston as his daughter is rejected from integrating the schools in Boston. And as he pays taxes, as others do, for free education, he decides to sue, and the case is led by Robert Morris, the second African-American attorney in the country, and Charles Sumner. The case is decided in Roberts versus the city of Boston by Judge Lemuel Shaw, who does levy the decision of what becomes separate but equal, that there are equal accommodations and the black children will attend separate schools. He said by law, we can make a law that would integrate the schools but not attitudes. And so it becomes the first case of Jim Crow. It also becomes a case that is cited in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, and then that which is overturned by Brown v. Board in 1954. So there's a 100-year span between what happens here at the A.B.L. Smith School and what happens in Brown versus the Board of Education to integrate schools nationally.
And a significant part of that whole controversy was about being taxed for something that you can't take
Once
advantage
again,
of. Taxes here in Boston.
The Massachusetts legislature does integrate schools in Massachusetts because of the case and other pressures by 1855. But that is not a national effort. And so we like to look at the fact that this school has levied for the protection of the children 5 great petitions that are signed by over 60,000 people that are signed in this building, in the African Meeting House, to integrate schools. There is a faction of the community that's looking at our black people best educated and best suited to educate their own children. So there are many tensions that continue to evolve, to be at the height of discussion and controversy indeed, as we issue forth into the 20th century even. So we are a place that has much focus on social issue and social justice, and are a site of about 200 years of that history.
And going back in time within the context of the first public school system in the American colonies.
Yes, absolutely.
Right here in Boston.
Right here in Boston.
Hi, my name is Ricardo John.
Hi, my name is Jason Malone.
Good morning. We are coming to you from downtown Boston at the corner of Washington and School Streets. I'm here with historian professor from Roxbury Community College, Professor Kevin Aylmer. And this morning we are going to tell you a little bit about the former home of Miss Anne Hutchinson.
Now, a brief story about the late lamented Anne Hutchinson, who came from England in the early 17th century, came to Boston and established a homestead in this site, now this Mexican restaurant. Unfortunately, she ran afoul of the Puritan ministers in town because as a midwife and as an herbalist, she attracted a lot of people for those services, and in the course of that ran into a controversy with the Puritan ministers concerning interpretations of the Bible and the Old Testament. Ultimately, she was expelled from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, exiled from here, went to Long Island, where she and most of her family were massacred by Indians. Meanwhile, here in Boston, she had caused so much trouble that the Puritan theocracy, the Puritan ministers of Boston, decided that they were not going to have any more of this, and for that reason they decided to establish a college, which we now know as Harvard College, to train ministers so that they can handle dissidents and rebellious immigrants like Anne Hutchinson. Now here's another extremely important site, the site known as Court Square, with the site of the old courthouse in Boston. But in 1854, this was the scene of an attempted rescue of a fugitive slave named Anthony Burns. It didn't work out so well. Let's hear from my intern, Ephia, who will explain a little bit of the details.
Anthony Burns was a fugitive slave. According to the Fugitive Slave Act, he didn't get a trial. He was taken and jailed immediately at the courthouse and waited for approval to be sent back to his slave owner in the South. Now, there was a futile effort, unfortunately, to go rescue him. Not enough people were involved, and a few got into the courthouse. There were chains, if you can imagine, all around it. And no sooner did they get in that a fight broke out, and one of the deputies, I believe, was stabbed. And basically everyone fled from the site as soon as the man was stabbed, and Anthony Burns ended up being taken back to his slave owner.
So when Anthony Burns was finally remanded, they had a huge troop of state militia and police forces in this area that escorted him down State Street onto a ship and sailed him back into slavery. So here we are once again opposite the Old South Meeting House on Washington Street, downtown Boston. And behind me is this nondescript McDonald's and CVS, which at one time was the site of the Royal House of the Governors of Massachusetts Bay, known as the Province House. Now, closer to time, this site was a minstrel theater. For those of you who don't know about the minstrel theaters, it's really the beginnings of what we know today as country music, when various traveling bands of white musicians would imitate the enslaved on plantations, imitate their phrases, their verbal quirks, and then bring down the house with depictions of plantation life and playing the music of the era. We associate, for example, with Stephen Foster of that time period. So imagine coming from Dark Square, we just were, and coming through here and just off a ship and seeing these kinds of stereotypical images of white people imitating African enslaved, also to the point of using burnt cork to blacken their faces, whiten their lips, which is a practice that continued in the early silent films. So that's where we get some of the stereotypical images that a lot of white Americans had for decades after the Civil War.
Oh, you're beautiful. Yes, beautiful. You're wonderful.